Alright, so Roblox tried offering extra money to games that force people to use r15 avatars, and it backfired in one of the worst ways possible. A lot of people remember back in June, when Roblox announced that developers could get a 42% pay bonus if they logged their games to r15 avatars for older players in the United States. They wanted to do this because apparently r15 looks so good and realistic that apparently everybody loves it, but it seems that only turned out to be a basic tutorial on how to ruin your own game. And it's pretty much what happened with a very popular game called Blade Ball, when the developer tried to take that money since it ended up taking 30% of their player base. Now, if you have ever played Blade Ball, which frankly I've actually played back in the good old days, 2024 specifically, you already know that the entire game relies on quick reflexes and movement and stuff. And ever since the start, the game ran on R6 avatars, which are the classic blocky characters that everyone is used to having, especially in older style Roblox games. Basically, it's simple, the hitboxes are predictable, and the game runs pretty smoothly without random input delay, and that's the sort of aspects that you really need to keep the game fun for everybody. So when Roblox put out that offer back in June, promising 42% more money for games that force R15, it was pretty obvious that the developers were going to be hooked by that money, since, you know, money, 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 everybody wants it, especially those managing the games on the front page. But trying to force R15 onto a specific game like Blade Ball was always going to be a really big decision, mainly because people who play competitive games on Roblox generally dislike R15 because the body parts move around too much and the extra animations make everything feel pretty heavy and slow. But still, the developers decided to force R15 on everyone under the premise that they might have just hit the jackpot. But instead of that jackpot, their numbers nosedive all the way down, and that's because the player base ran into some really bad issues across the entire game, especially the lower frame rates, the constant stutters during matches, and a bunch of stores that use custom poses were pretty much broken and needed separate fixes. On top of that, over 1,000 in-game emails broke because of how the R15 model works, which made it practically impossible for developers to fix everything in a reasonable amount of time. And because of all these huge issues, you have these people who called out the update as an obvious cash grab that threw away the features and smooth performance of the game just to chase that extra money from Roblox. Nobody wants to deal with the bugged emails, broken sword poses, and the constant frame drops in a game where it's all about timing and speed, and it's pretty clear that this update brought in way too many problems for the games to actually function properly. And the worst part of this whole situation is that the game's active player count took a huge dive almost immediately, as thousands of people just chose not to play the game because of this update. Now, as you can see in this graph right here, where we can see the active player count, the game was holding steady around 15,000 active players, but when you look over to the right of that, when the R15 update was released, you can see it drop all the way down to around 10,000 players. So that's a 30% drop in player count in a really short amount of time, and it pretty much shows how much everyone hated this update, since they were literally quitting instead of dealing with all these issues. Now, when a popular game starts losing 30% of its players over one update, that is always something that gets developers' attention right away. Then they basically have no choice but to realize that the extra money from Roblox is not going to make up for losing a third of their player base, and if they don't do something about it as soon as possible, they'll eventually just end up losing money in the long run. So one of the main developers ended up having to fix the issue by bringing back R6 avatars as fast as they could before things got even worse for the game. When he finally posted an announcement in a Discord server, they had to admit that forcing R15 was a mistake and that they were switching everything back to R6 as it worked straight through the night to revert things back to the way they were before even more players decided to quit the game. So it ended up being a total walk of shame for the developers after chasing the extra cash, since they literally had to pull an emergency fix just to put out the fire, which ultimately proves that forcing players onto R15 is nowhere near as simple as Roblox made it sound when they first announced this pay increase. This whole situation shows why Roblox offering extra money to force R15 on people is such a risky decision for developers, mainly because the higher-ups want every game to look modern using their relatively new avatar systems, while ignoring the fact that so many popular games only work properly on R6. When you take a game that depends entirely on competition and timing and all that stuff, and force detailed body animations on it, the performance and the whole feeling of the game literally gets burned to the ground. And essentially the developers were blinded by the promise of free extra jackpot money, while they ended up breaking the exact gameplay they made their game popular to begin with. It seems pretty clear that Roblox thought offering this extra payback in June would get developers to upgrade their games without running into real issues, but in reality, it just created a setup where dev teams push out updates that everybody hates just to squeeze out a little bit more profit. And if you couldn't think of a good example of how this all plays out, then Blade Ball is basically the perfect choice, since the dev just took the bait and got burned immediately. When one single R15 update has this sort of ability, where it can drop like 30% of your whole player base in such a short period of time, no extra bonus per cash is going to save your game from falling off a cliff, once people realize that keeping your players engaged is worth much more than a corporate cash grab. At the end of the day, Blade Ball had to give up on that 42% pay boost and crawl right back into R6 just to keep their game alive, which ultimately proves that trying to force R15 for extra money backfired in every way possible. And it will be pretty difficult for the game and its devs to earn their trust back from this point forward, unless going back to R6 helps them get their numbers back up again, but it seems to not be really likely for now.